Hello everyone. I've been trying my best to understand the rules of Western, and I'm really struggling. So I'm going to sort of put it on ice, I'm afraid. Um, while I'm really kind of immersed in the subject, though, I'm going to carry on painting figures and so on, and build my way up to sufficient forces to play a game of Black Powder, the scenario in the new second edition of Black Powder, and then hoping that the republication of Pony Wars by Bacchus, which will be the autumn of this year, will prove a satisfactory set of rules to play. But I want to do a little video just on some of my reflections on this set of rules. As you can see, I had a table laid out. I've been playing on this table, basically just going through the rules, playing a game, jotting down things that I wasn't sure of, and then going through the rules again, trying to find answers, and I just can't do it. And not particularly good lighting conditions today, I'm afraid, but I want to do it here over on this table so that I can just demonstrate a few of the issues. And you may remember on a previous video I was talking about my cat that I thought belonged to my neighbour. It does indeed belong to my neighbour. So he may interfere. I don't know, because the weather's so bad outside today. He was looking a bit sort of plaintive outside my back door, so I thought I'd let him in. But he's got a collar on him now. I went round to my neighbour and asked if he did own him, and he said yeah he did, and he said half the street had been feeding him thinking it was a stray. He was a stray, and he's not. So he put a collar on him now saying, please do not feed me. But I took pity on him, let him in out the rain today. Right, so general feelings about Western and Peter Pig in general. I really like AK-47 and Hammer in Iron. They're two of my favourite sets of rules. I've always kind of shied away though from the rules that involve grids, like Poor Bloody Infantry and so on. I have got a couple of them, square bashing and what's it called? Something like something in the Age of Warfare. The samurai game is played on a gridded map. I've got both of those, and been interested in them, but I wasn't sure how I was going to react to grids, and because for those periods I've got other rule sets that I'm much happier with, I never took them up. But I saw Western being played at show Selwig a couple of years back, and visually it was so appealing. I thought I'm going to give this a try, and it's taken me a while because of various personal reasons and so on to get the game together, and it's very kind of deflating now. But as I say, in general I do like Peter Pig rules, but these I don't know, there's a lot in it now. It comes across to me as a little bit kind of almost pompous and conceited. It's hard to describe, but I just get that impression. Some of the kind of throwaway remarks are a little bit kind of superior. Things like it's meant to be they don't use the word realistic, but they say not Hollywood version of sort of Western games. It's almost implying that it's a very kind of accurate portrayal, realistic portrayal. They don't go as far as saying that. and they say it's designed to so that you're not just lining your troops up and so on. That's true, but making them move around in squares, and I'll go into this a little bit later, doesn't mean that it's any more realistic than drawing them up in lines. There's things like they make a point of saying that all the images in this book, there's some there, are designed to demonstrate the rules rather than being there as kind of eye candy. And fair enough, but a lot of people like eye candy. A lot of people buy rule books, partly because they are so well presented and colourful and so on. There's nothing wrong with a rule book, rather than this sort of black and white photography. So I'm not. What I'm saying is basically they get on their high horse a little bit, and it's that kind of put me off right from the start. But anyway, another thing they do right at the start here is talk about they thank the lead playtesters, and they say all the rules for the common man, all rules for the common man rules undergo thorough playtesting and evolution by a marvellous team of gamers. Now I'm sure they do, but herein lies the problem really, that if you can't adequately communicate the rules to the general reader, then all that thorough playtesting has gone to waste. I'm not going to sort of boast too much, but I am a very well educated person, and I'm not unintelligent, and I can't understand a lot of these rules, and so it must be down to the way it's worded. And I think the trouble with there is such a kind of volume of there's such a mass of Peter Pig rules now, and they've sort of evolved over the years. There's a channel called Billy Goat Wargaming. I think he may well be one of the playtesters of the rules, but he put out a video recently. His real name is Sean. Showing all the rules that he's got going back decades, that he's got from Peter Pig, and how really they have, been the mainstay of his wargaming hobby throughout the years, and given him a great deal of pleasure. And he actually he sort of has Western, and he did briefly, show it, and said that he'd had many enjoyable games of it. To me, I don't enjoy a game if I have to fathom what the intention of some of the rules are, and this isn't a game that you can really play solo. I can play it with, I know people who would be interested in playing this game with me, but they are going to be just as stumped by some of the situations in this rule book as I am, and then you have to stop and kind of puzzle and debate amongst yourselves, and that slows the game down. And also you might come to an agreement about the way it's meant to be played, but the pair of you might be wrong, and you might come to you might disagree about how the rules are meant to be interpreted, and end up saying, well, let's throw a dice, 50-50, if you win, well, play it your way, or vice versa. That's totally unsatisfactory to me, because there's a 50% chance that you're going to be playing it wrong. And I'm not saying the people that I play with would do this, but I do know a lot of people who will deliberately argue the case, that a rule should be interpreted in a certain way simply to get an advantage, and then say, let's toss a coin, knowing there's a 50% chance that they'll get their way, even though they are sort of deliberately kind of biasing their kind of interpretation to favour their own cause. So I don't like that. But a good case in point is to get back to this way the Peter Pig rules have evolved, is that I think if you are familiar with Peter Pig rules, which the playtesters obviously are, then you wouldn't even see a problem if you picked these rules up and read through them, because you know how Peter Pig rules play. And a good case in point is, and this is made clear in this book, it just needs careful reading, is on the matter of re-rolls. Now, if I roll, say, 6 dice, how many have I got here? 6 dice, and I need 5s or 6 for a hit. Yeah, so I've got 1. There are lots of conditions under which you're allowed re-rolls. Now, to me, I think the majority of wargamers would interpret re-rolls as meaning that you pick up the dice that failed to get 5 or 6 and you re-roll them. So I've got another 1 there. That is not the case with this set of rules, and I suspect with other rules in Peter Pig, although certainly it's not the case with AK-47, but maybe with the later sort of generations of gridded games. You're meant to pick up all the dice and roll them again. A re-roll means that you re-roll all the dice. So that is one kind of simple example about how you can misinterpret the rules if you have a lack of familiarity with previous rule sets. But to give them their due, that is clearly described in the text in these rules. Re-rolls do involve re-rolling all the dice and not just some of them. I might sort of have to, because there's going to be a lot of flicking through pages and so on, you might find that this video is quite heavily edited to kind of leave out the sort of pauses and so on. But to get to this matter of playing on a grid, now the big advantage of using gridded mats is that you don't have to use rulers. Fantastic. You can just look at the mat and you can count the number of squares that you have to travel or the range and so on, and it saves you having a ruler out on the table. But there are lots of disadvantages to playing with a grid. In here somewhere, and I might just pause this video until I found it. Yeah, here we are. Let's move some of this scenery out of the way a little bit. Okay, there are no diagonal measurements. Fine, so that's perfectly clear. You don't take measurements diagonally. This applies to all motivations. So motivations are the action points, I think. More on that later. Anyway, this applies to all motivations, movement, shooting and morale. Okay, now that is a fairly black and white definitive statement. When you read that on page 2 of the rules and you think you've got that in your head, so you kind of it's a very kind of clear instruction for how to interpret the rules as you go along. So remember that: motivations, movement, shooting and morale. Okay, now I'm going to pause the camera, flip through the rules and show you how many exceptions to that very black and white statement there are. Okay, well, let's start with shooting, as I've come to that page first of all. If you remember, there are no diagonal measurements. No diagonal measurements. Go back to that. This applies to all motivations, movement, shooting and morale. There are no diagonal measurements. Okay, now in the rules you have basically 3 types of weapon. You have short shooters, long shooters and bows. That's basically it. So despite all this lovely kind of descriptions of the various weapons of the period and so on, they all fall into one of those three categories. Short shooters, so you can see here, I think that an 8051 Navy Colt is a short shooter. Bows are obviously bow category. Then you got the Springfields and Spencer carbines and so on, and they are long shooters. So short shooters have a range. Just pause again so I don't. Yeah, sorry about that. This video, as I say, I'm going to edit it quite a lot, so it's going to be very kind of stop-start type of commentary. Here are the ranges. Now, short shooters have a maximum range of what they describe as proximity. Bows, 3 squares, long shooters, 4 squares. Now, this proximity incorporates diagonal squares. So each square is meant to, if I remember rightly, it's meant to be 50 meters in real size, and a short shooter has a range of 60 meters. Again, I'm just going to pause the camera so I can show you that in black and white. Yep, here it is. Short shooter range, so remember that's things like the pistols and so on, is 60 meters. Diagonals allowed. So this is only on page 5, so 3 pages in, they're actually contradicting their previous statement about shooting. Bow range 150, so that's 3 squares, long shooter range 200 meters. So short shooters do not have short range, they have longer than short range. This is the thing about the squares beginning to kind of throw little spanners in the works. Short range is actually just the 4 facing squares of the shooting square. Now that is a factor in another issue, which is something in the rules which is fine. They've decided that they want to use it, but I found it really does clog the whole game up. Is that there's a thing called opportunity shooting, and that is only done at short range. So if there is a unit in a short range square, here we are, I have it here. So this is the group. Short range is the 4 facing squares of that group. If there is a group adjacent to the group in one of the group's facing squares, as the minute it's their turn and the player wants to activate that group, then the opponent's group can opportunity shoot at that group before it's done anything, whilst it's rolling to see how many action points it wants. So you immediately get, before the player's done anything, you immediately get shot at by the group he's the neighbour to. Then he might decide he wants to shoot back at that group. Fine. But then the group that has already shot at him once can return the fire. So they get a second shot at him. Okay, opportunity shooting and return shooting scores on a 6 and not on a 5 or 6. But it's still 2 lots of fire for one, and this is the active player trying to shoot at him. The active player is actually getting less shots than the controlling player. This is something that I'm sure I have interpreted correctly, by the way. It's not something that confuses me. I'm going to get onto all those later. Then if that player decides he wants to move somewhere and he ends up moving into another square, of another group or even the same group that's facing, then that group instantly has an opportunity to shoot at him for a third time. I just find that, over it's excessive. While I've got this page here, though, this is a definition of proximity. So if you remember, short shooters have a range of proximity, so they can shoot diagonally. Okay, that's enough about shooting and how, that contradicts that very kind of black and white statement at the beginning that no diagonal shooting is allowed. It is plainly is. Now, that statement also said morale. Remember that proximity is defined as all, so how many is that? 9, 6, 7, 8. All the 8 adjacent squares are defined as being proximity. Just going to flip the page again. Okay, we're on the morale page here. Now, as I was just explaining, when it's the player's turn and they want to activate a group, if they are adjacent to an opponent's square, then they have to roll to see how much their morale is reduced, and then that is then deducted from their roll to see how many action points they've got. Now, morale is only taken if one or more opponent groups are in proximity. Very deliberate choice of words there. Proximity, that means that morale does take effect diagonally as well, not just in the facing squares. So two of those categories in that very definitive statement at the beginning of the text that you put into your head and think, right, I've got that in my head and I know how to interpret the rules from now on. Two of them are already contradicted. Now I'm going to go on to movement. Okay, here's just one example. There are a couple. I might just talk about them without flipping through the pages. After a melee or after an assault, then the losing player has to fall back. So it can't occupy. Two groups can't occupy the same square. So the losing group has to fall back into a vacant square. And here, I'm going to focus. You can see quite clearly if the assaulter wins and the target has to fall back, then it suffers 4d6 pursuit wounded. Now that, again, is incredibly damaging. They've already lost. The groups tend to be, on average, about 6, 7, 8. I mean, a veteran group can't be more than 6 bases in total. They suffer 4d6 pursuit wounded, and you're wounded on a 5 or a 6, so there's a high chance that you're going to get more wounded as you're pursued. They fall back to any desired facing square except the square the assaulter came from. So that's fine. We know what the facing squares are. They are the short range squares that have an adjacent edge. If none available, then proximity. So under certain circumstances, you can move diagonally because proximity is all of the 8 surrounding squares, remember. So again, unless you read these rules very carefully and find these exceptions, you're going to start by playing it that diagonals aren't allowed, and get kind of confused by it. So so far you've got movement, morale, and shooting are all are all exceptions to that statement at the beginning that you can't move diagonally. I mean, there's another case in point when you're bringing. Let's just try and zoom out a little bit. I'm at the table edge here, so at the corner, so I might as well show you on a map. I can't remember who it is. It might be either the defender or I think it's the defender. When the defending player is bringing their groups on at the beginning of the game, so when you're deploying, the defender deploys first. The defender groups are deployed at a d6 distance from the corners into the table internal squares, not necessarily along the table's edge squares. So into, to me, implies that you have to go that way. So what if you roll a 1? You're going to have to either move there, or ignore this rule about moving diagonally. Sorry, I've got my... so if you roll a 1, you either move there or there, but that way you're not moving into the table's internal squares, are you? I think probably if you roll a 1, you move along the table edge is the way I would interpret it. But that's a case in point about how it's not particularly clear. One player might, have a different opinion to another. Right, just pause the camera again. So there are only 4 categories there: motivations, movement, shooting, and morale. So I've already shown you that movement, shooting, and morale can move diagonally under certain circumstances. Not necessarily even uncommon circumstances. I mean, it's quite common to be able to fire at short range diagonally. But I really don't know what they mean by motivations. That seems to fall under the same kind of category as morale to me. I just looked it up and wondered if when you're rolling for action points, whether a commander being an adjacent square, the leader of the group has to be in the same square as the group. The leaders and groups can't detach from one another, but the commander can move around and might be in an adjacent square, but even the commander has to be in the same square as the group to get a bonus when you're rolling for action points. So I'm not sure what motivations are. They're certainly not in the index, and I can't find a chapter or a category to cover motivations, so I think that's more or less the same heading as morale. So that's enough on just on that one sentence. I mean, you can probably hear in my voice that it's not just frustrating, it is a little bit annoying, I have to admit. It is beginning to kind of irritate me, the fact that I can't fathom these rules out. And, as far as I know, I mean, I don't do Facebook anyways. There certainly isn't a website that you can go to that answers frequently answered questions and so on. But there are quite a lot of videos on if you go to the Peter Pig website, there are a lot of videos explaining the rules of Western. I've found them virtually no use whatsoever, because they all explain things that are perfectly understandable. They don't deal with all these very grey areas. But one of the things that I've most had difficulty with is at the beginning of the game you have to decide who is the attacker and who the defender. And part of that process is that you have to deal with this aggression levels table. Now, as you can see, there are all the different categories that can play in game. So there are Indians, Apaches, gunmen, Mexicans, army, posse, cattlemen, workers, townsfolk, and settlers. There are a lot of different ways that you can form your army and describe what it is. And there are 9 different aggression levels which have what are called a narrative intent. So there is hold out, that's the least aggressive choice that you can make, right the way up to destroy, which is the most aggressive. Now, what you do is you find your army. So in my case, say I'm going to be playing Plains Indians, and then I pick what aggression level I wish. If I pick holdout, then I'm going to be rolling 9 dice against my opponent. This is simply to see how many successes you get, and the number of successes determines that the player with the highest number is the attacking player. If I've chosen destroy, then I'm going to be rolling 28 dice, and that's just on this. There are lots of other dice that you add to this roll, by the way. Now that kind of all makes sense, except as you can see, there are an awful lot of blank squares. Now, how do you interpret those blank squares? I can think of 4 possible ways to interpret them, 2 of which you can dismiss quite quickly. One is to say it's blank because there's no need to keep repeating the number, and I'm reading it from left to right. So that clearly isn't the case, because under the holdout scenario, the Indians, everything that has got a number is rolling 9. So at the beginning of the line and at the end of the line is 9. So there is nothing, there's nothing to indicate what the Mexicans should be rolling if you're reading it from left to right. If you're reading it down, so let's take the Mexicans again. If you're reading it down from top to bottom, then you would think, looking at that the Mexicans maybe should be rolling 11 dice. But again, I don't think that's the case, because if you go across to the Indians, for instance, the exit choice is 17 dice, holdout is 9. There's 3 blank spaces in between. Are you reading that down? So up until scout, they're rolling 9. That doesn't work either. Especially here, look, with the gunman, it goes from 9 for holdout, and the next figure is 23 for choice number 7, which is opportunities. So the only conclusion I can come to is that either the Mexicans can choose the holdout option, but they don't get to roll any dice whatsoever, or they can't choose the holdout at all, so they have to make a choice from one of those 4. Now, of those 2 particular options, I think the latter is a little bit absurd. There's no reason to suppose that the Mexicans wouldn't want to go out on an opportunistic raid, for instance, or to destroy the Apache if they were going out after the Apache. So I think that the choice is there, but if you choose that choice, you don't get to roll anything. Doesn't make sense to me whatsoever. Why stop the Mexicans going out on a raid to attack and destroy the Apache? It's just balmy. And there's a massive difference It is sort of meant to be the case that as you go from right to left, these groups are more aggressive. But you know, it seems to be very arbitrary to my mind. Just going to pause the camera for a second again, just while I flip through some pages. Yeah, here we are, found the paragraph. So at the end of the game, there's a lot of working out of victory points, which is good. I like that in Peter Pig rules. I mean, AK-47 have that. But one of the ways that you add victory points to the defender is that if the defender chose an aggression level which is higher than the attacker, say, but then they got less hits with the number of dice they rolled. Basically, the first four are the number of dice you roll are determined by the difference in the aggression level. And the aggression level ranges from 1 to 9. It's not the number of dice you rolled. But there is this statement here clarifying what they mean by a lower aggression level. And it says, this is to compensate the defender for having a smaller force. The level refers to the number of aggression levels below the attacker. All other levels count, whether there was an aggression number available or not. So, in other words, I think that does, clinch it, that you can choose a square that doesn't have an aggression number in it, but it means that you roll no dice. And I just can't get my head around that at all. I'm sorry, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And it's something that I'm kind of debating with myself. When you get into a game, another player could have a completely different interpretation of this, and you waste time trying to work out what to do. And presumably there's a similar mechanism in a lot of the other gridded games from Peter Pig, and the playtesters, the rules for the common man group, are all so familiar with it that it doesn't even cross their minds. Right, now I want to go on to something that is really bugging me. Okay, I want to talk a bit next about reinforcements and wounded, because this is where, personally I think the game completely falls apart. So what I've got set up here, laid out here, is a representative force for the army. I'm pretty sure that it's laid out completely legally. So I'll just go through what I've got here. It's 300 points. You get for free a commander and a reinforcement leader, completely free. Okay, remember that. Then I've got 4 groups. The first group is a group of 9 bases. They are raw army. So they're on foot. Each one of the leader base costs me 20 points, and the foot are raw, and they cost 5 points each. So in other words, that is 5 times 8 is 40, plus 20 is 60 points. Now the other 3 groups are all identical. They're all veteran. They are mounted with long shooters. Oh yeah, the raw group have long shooters as well, but that's included in that cost. The mounted are veteran, and with long shooters. So each base of those is 12 points, plus the leader for each base is 20 points again. So that's 80 points, 80 points, 80 points, and 60 points. So the whole thing is the 300 point requirement. Now, let's assume that this is the attacking side. It gets a lot more complicated if they were the defending side, but we'll start by describing what happens if they are attacking side. During the game, they will obviously suffer wounds. Now the reinforcement leader, at the before the game begins, you have to nominate a size of the for the reinforcement group. That can be anything from no bases whatsoever, so you don't want to use any reinforcements. Can't see any reason why you would choose not to have a reinforcement group, but it can range from 0 to 8. Now there's a maximum number of figures that you can have for a particular quality of group. You're only allowed 6 maximum in a group if they're veteran. So if you choose to have a reinforcement group of 8, then that reinforcement group can't come on as veteran. Now, how do you form the reinforcements, and how do they come on? So let's assume that as the game goes on, we lose 2 from there, and I've nominated I've nominated a maximum of 6, so that theoretically I could have my reinforcements as veteran. So I'll put 2 markers there where I've lost 2 from there, 2 wounded markers there, and 1 in each of the other squares. Now, the minute, oh hang on, I've made a mistake already, because you include the reinforcement leader in that group. So let's assume that they didn't suffer a wound. So I've now got, as the game's gone on, I've now taken 6 bases off, 5 bases off, and they've gone on the side of the table with this reinforcement leader. So I've got a group of 6 there. So I'm ready to bring those on as reinforcements. So at the end of my turn, what I will do is I'll roll, I can't remember the exact figure, I think it's 4, 5 or 6. If I score a 4, 5 or 6, that means one of those bases is ready to come back on to the table. So as the game progresses, slowly going to have them all at readiness to come back on. The problem is, well, there are quite a few problems now. I'm sort of stuttering because it's really hard to know what to talk about first. One of the first issues is that all the reinforcement group is reduced to the worst type present. So by that it means that if these are all armed with long shooters, but if any of these wounded had been a short shooter group, then all of those figures, even though it's not what you, from then on it's not what you see is what you get, even though these guys might have long shooters, if these guys had short shooters, they're all determined to have short shooters. That gets difficult then to sort of, when you start playing with them on the table, you have to start making notes of this. And remember, Also, if they're raw, and in this case they are all raw. So in this particular game, it wouldn't be too much of a problem. I just have to remember that this reinforcement group is all raw, but because they all had long shooters, that's not going to cause me an issue in this, in this particular game. It just it just seems to me, it's kind of it's cumbersome. It's very clunky, but it is sort of playable. It does make sense. It's just not something that I feel is tidy in any way. I don't like that. But the added complication is that there is another complication, by the way, as well. The next complication that I want to add to this is that, remember, I have these wounded markers on the table. Now, groups are allowed to carry their wounded with them from square to square. As long as you've got one space that you can match up with one wounded marker, then you're fine. You can carry those wounded around. That makes it a lot easier because the wounded markers are all assumed to be the same, sort of identical. So there's no difference in the wounded marker that represents a leader who might have got wounded, or a mounted figure or a dismounted figure. So even though it's clear that those wounded belong to that group, the markers are identical. Okay, so that no longer represents a wounded raw figure, even though that the base that I took off does clearly represent a wounded raw figure, because that has a determining effect on what category my reinforcement group is going to be. It's quite possible in the game that wounded markers get left behind. Okay, that group might move on. It might be compelled to leave its wounded behind because it has so many wounded that it hasn't got enough bases to carry them all, so it has to leave wounded behind. And this is why it doesn't matter. You don't have to keep track that is a raw wounded marker. It's just a wounded marker. But at the end of I think it's at the end of your turn. Yeah, at the end of the owning player's turn, there's a chance that the wounded markers are going to die. There's also a chance that they will recover and be brought back onto the table. But the chances of them dying increase with if they've been left on their own, and they increase even more if an enemy group is in the square, occupying the square. So there's a very good chance that they will die, and if they do, you then take the wounded marker off the table and put it back in the bag. And that's fairly clear-cut decision. But if they recover, then you're allowed to recover. If you roll a 6, you're allowed to recover up to 2 wounded bases and put them back on the table. This isn't reinforcements, this is putting them back into play per your turn. The very first one that recovers, the opponent, not you, chooses which group that is going to go, to be recovered to. So in other words, those 2 wounded markers might still be in the same square as the group, that they came from originally. But the first one to recover, the opponent will say, I want you to replace that figure with X group. So in this particular case, say it was here, the opponent isn't going to want you to bring back a veteran mounted cavalryman. He's going to say, I want you to restore one of those raw foot soldiers that are obviously a lot less quality. So you put the figure back there. What do you do then? Do you then take this wounded token off the table that you've rolled for? I think you have to, but then there's a potential here that you're going, if both of those were to later in the game recover, because the second one in this group, you have to replace, if it recovers, you have to replace it with the group that owned it. I'm pretty sure. Oh no, hang on, maybe you don't. But there's still the potential there to repopulate this square with more figures than you should do. You have to keep track of that as well. It is a little bit untidy, I think. The other thing, obviously, here is that you might already have brought this group on. So this base is already in place somewhere else on the table. So you have to have more figures in your collection in order to be able to put a raw infantryman back there. That's not always, available to people. In my case, it would be, but it wouldn't be if it was the other way around and I was trying to find another cavalry base. So it's just so yuck, really. If the group had been on their own, if the wounded markers had been left on their own, then you do still roll for them, but they then obviously have to go into, if they recover, into one of these other groups somewhere on the table. They can't be put down in that square in isolation. All very difficult and odd. There's something else that really was puzzling me about the way this works. It's not come to me now, so I have to skip it. But we're still on the attacking player for the time being, to remember. So this group is now, say we've got away with this and we have got sufficient figures and they've all rolled ready to come back on the table. What you do, according to this, which bases are ready to arrive? At the end of every turn, the owner rolls 4d6. Each 5 to 6 means the base is ready. Re-roll allowed if mounted. That's interesting in itself. If they're mounted, does that mean you have to re-roll all 4 d6? I think you should do, but it doesn't say so here. Mounted groups must arrive mounted. Group can only arrive when every base is ready, so that's fine. How to arrive: choose any table edge square not in proximity to the opponent group, no deviation. Mounted groups may not arrive in buildings very rough hills. So it has to go into any edge square. Now I'm pretty sure that that's the end of the turn. You put them there, and the next turn is going to be the opponent's turn anyway, so they have a chance to react to the arrival of that reinforcement group. In AK-47, you have to allow a turn where the reinforcement group can't be activated to give the player a chance. But I think the player, that's sufficient notification for the player. So that is all I'm going to say about the attacking group. But now let's talk about if you're the defending player. So we put let's say that for some reason we're playing a scenario where we've chosen that the army is beleaguered by invading Plains Indians or Apaches or whatever, and the result of the roll-off at the beginning of the game has determined that the player is the defending player. Now, this adds immensely to the complications. You already have a reinforcement leader, okay, but the defending player is allowed 2 reinforcement groups. And the reason for that is that, excuse me a minute, just want to pause. Yeah, just been flicking through the pages to get to the appropriate spot, but just on a previous point, I've just seen here, so I was talking about why there are blank squares on this page. So I've just noticed in the sort of narrative explanations, there's a blank there for choice number 3, which is lead on for the group A, which is the Indians. And yet in the narrative here for this, it gives typical examples of what the narrative might be. And in lead on, it's got, we will lead them away from the villages. Now, to me, villages are going to belong principally to either the Indians or the Apaches. Neither of them roll dice for lead on. It just doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. Anyway, the page I was looking for is, if you're the defending player, at the beginning of the game, you're going to automatically lose a lot of your bases. That's intentional mechanism to mean that you're outnumbered by the attacker at the beginning of the game. So for every group, you roll a dice for each base in that group, and on a 1 or a 2 you remove the base. There are some modifiers for that, but let's stick with the simple example. So in other words, you can lose about, they estimate you're going to lose about 1/3 of your bases. Now, if you lose, I think it's more than 11 bases, which is quite conceivable. Sorry, just got to go back to the original page. Yeah, if you lose more than 11 bases, so let's take off, we'll take off 4 from there. They were really unlucky. 2 from there, what's that, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, so we've lost 12 bases in total. So that is my that is the number of figures that I've lost just from rolling at the beginning of the game to see how many figures are going to go. So the second group, if you're the defending player, has to be the same size as the nominated group that you've picked for your that you're going to put with your reinforcement leader. I forget what I said. Did I say 6? I think I said 6. So that means already that these bases here are over the maximum size that I'd stated. So I can effectively form up my 2 defending groups almost immediately. What have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah. So the leader counts as a group. So if I put him over here, that means this group is surplus. It also means that this group here doesn't have a leader. I haven't lost the leader off the table, so they presumably are going to have to migrate around the table without a leader, which you can do. Leaders can get killed. Both groups must be the same size as that chosen on the player's battle sheet. Yeah, I've said that. And apart from the fact that the first two bases are deemed to be ready, you have to roll for the rest in exactly the same way. Now, I'm aware, that's completely baffled me. Because I have my two reinforcement groups ready to go at the very beginning. Presumably, I can choose to say that this group here, because they are all consistent, they're all long-shooted mounted veterans, I can call them a veteran group. And because they don't have a leader, they fit within the maximum capacity of a veteran group. But over here, I can put all my raw into one group, meaning they drag this group down to the lowest level. That kind of, it's a bit cheesy, maybe, but I think that would be legitimate within the rules. But of course, the other problem is that I haven't started playing the game yet at all. There are going to be wounds inflicted on these other, groups that are on the table, and I haven't had, and I'm not going to get the opportunity to bring them back as reinforcements because my reinforcement groups are already full. So the whole thing about carrying your wounded around, on the battlefield is going to make absolutely no difference. You might as well leave all your wounded behind because they do drag you down in certain circumstances. When you're rolling, I think it's when you're rolling for action points. I won't look that up now, but there is an occasion, I think it is when you're rolling for action point. Might be when you're rolling for morale. But you're better off if you're the defending player and you've got that situation at the beginning of the game. You're better off not carrying your wounded around them, just leaving them to die in another square, basically. And that I'm going to stop now because I've been going on for ages. That's just a few examples of the frustration that I'm feeling with this sort of rules, and also haven't really gone into how, I haven't shown you how the game. I don't intend to play this game and give you a battle report because it's just so. I'm just so hesitant myself about how to interpret some of the rules, but I have found that even when the game is playing as it should, and I'm confident I'm interpreting the rules correctly, that I don't like the way it plays. I don't like the grid system. I think it's far too easy to suffer casualties, especially if you try to be active rather than passive. There seems to be a penalty for activating your groups, and it's been a big disappointment and frustration to me, but enough said. So I'm looking forward. I think I said at the beginning that what I'm going to do is I've got lots more figures to paint. I'm going to paint up some much larger forces, and then I'll be able to play that scenario that's in Black Powder. And I'm really looking forward to the arrival of Pony Wars in the autumn. But I'm afraid Western is not for me. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. See you on the next video. Bye for now.